The scream of chainsaws shattered my quiet lakeside morning. By the time I reached the property line, the damage was already done. The century-old oaks shielding my land from the gated community above had been butchered, leaving my home completely exposed. The HOA elite wanted an unobstructed view of the water, and they didn't care about trespassing to get it. Standing in the sawdust of my ruined trees, I realized they thought my silence was surrender. They thought they had finally broken me. But by tearing down my natural wall, they just gave me the perfect canvas to build something much worse. How far would you go when entitled neighbors destroy your sanctuary? Turning 30 changed exactly what I wanted out of life. After spending my 20s grinding in the city as a business intelligence developer, buried under complex SQL queries and endless dashboard visuals, the constant, suffocating hum of the urban grind had completely burned me out. I didn't want to look at another concrete skyline. I needed a sanctuary. I found it in a forgotten, 10-acre slice of heaven tucked away on the edge of the lake. The property was heavily wooded and entirely raw, a wild, beautiful mix of thick pines and towering, century-old oaks. That natural, towering curtain of green was the sole reason I bought the place. It created an absolute, impenetrable wall of privacy around my modest, single-story ranch house. In the evenings, after logging off from a long day of untangling messy data pipelines, I would head out to the lawn, set up a net for a quiet game of badminton, and just breathe. Hidden beneath the dense canopy, I was entirely disconnected from the chaos of the world. But true isolation is a luxury, and mine was geographically compromised. Directly behind my property, rising up on a steep, artificially terraced ridge, sat the Crest. It was an ultra-exclusive, hyper-regulated gated community filled with modern, multi-million-dollar estates. The entire subdivision had been designed with one specific selling point in mind: the water. Every home featured massive, floor-to-ceiling glass windows and sprawling back decks that jutted out over the hillside. The developers of the Crest had sold those residents on the promise of unobstructed, panoramic lake views. But there was a glaring, deeply frustrating flaw in their luxury marketing brochure. My trees were in the way. Thanks to my university background in geographic information systems, I had meticulously studied the topography, elevation models, and historical surveys of the land before I ever signed the deed. I knew exactly where their jurisdiction ended and my sanctuary began. I knew with absolute scientific certainty that the massive oaks stretching 70 feet into the sky, the ones currently blocking the million-dollar sightlines of the residents above, were planted firmly on my dirt. I wasn't part of their homeowners association, and their restrictive covenants held zero weight on my side of the boundary line. For the first few months, the peace was unbroken. But as the summer approached and the trees blossomed into a thick, lush, completely opaque wall of leaves, the quiet tension began to build. I started to feel the entitlement leaking down the hill. It began innocently enough with anonymous, glossy flyers left tucked into my mailbox. They were thinly veiled advertisements from luxury landscaping companies, accompanied by end-signed notes suggesting that thinning the canopy would vastly improve the health of the local ecosystem. I tossed them in the recycling bin. Then came the surveillance. When I was out in the yard, I would catch the glint of binoculars from the massive decks above. I would see groups of residents standing at the edge of their manicured ridge, pointing aggressively down at my oak canopy, their body language stiff with frustration. They had paid millions for a view of the water, and instead, they were forced to look at the top of my personal forest. To them, my privacy was stealing their property value. They saw my trees not as a part of nature, but as a deliberate insult to their wealthy lifestyle. I ignored the stares and the passive-aggressive flyers, assuming they would eventually realize they had no legal leg to stand on. I thought the steep, rocky drop-off between our properties was a physical and legal barrier that would keep their HOA politics out of my life forever. I had vastly underestimated the arrogance of people who are used to getting exactly what they want. They didn't just want a view, they demanded it. and they were already planning a way to take it right over my property line. The escalation didn't begin with a conversation. It began with an invoice. I checked my mail one evening after a brutal week of building data pipelines, expecting nothing more than utility bills. Instead, I pulled out a heavy, watermarked envelope bearing the official crest of the neighborhood above me. Inside was a formal citation demanding the immediate payment of $5,000 for aesthetic obstruction and property value degradation. The document coldly outlined how the canopy of my oak trees was actively violating the visual rights of the residents of the crest. It came complete with a deadline and a threat to place a lien on my property if the fine wasn't paid. I stood in my driveway, staring at the paper, a mixture of disbelief and pure, boiling anger washing over me. I did not live in their subdivision. I had never signed their restrictive covenants. To them, the legal boundary separating our lands was completely irrelevant. Their wealth and status made them believe they had blanket jurisdiction over the entire lakefront. I tore the citation into pieces and threw it in the trash, assuming this was just a heavy-handed scare tactic meant to bully the lone guy at the bottom of the hill. I thought ignoring them would be the end of it. I had no idea they were just testing my defenses. When the fake fines didn't work, the HOA board shifted their strategy from intimidation to weaponized bureaucracy. They realized they couldn't legally force me to cut the trees themselves, so they decided to make the city do their dirty work. A week later, a county fire marshal's truck crawled down my secluded access road. The HOA had filed dozens of anonymous complaints claiming my property was a severe fire hazard, insisting that the density of my trees posed an immediate threat to the multimillion-dollar homes on the ridge. For a moment, genuine panic set in. Dealing with local government is a nightmare, and the HOA had deep pockets and political connections. They were trying to use the law to force a mandatory clear-cutting of my land. But they underestimated who they were dealing with. They didn't realize that my entire professional life was built on geographic information systems, data extraction, and spatial analysis. I didn't just argue with the fire marshal. I buried him in data. I spent 3 sleepless nights pulling satellite imagery, topological maps, and historical soil density reports. I created a comprehensive visual model proving that the root systems of my ancient oaks were the only things physically holding the steep, rocky ridge together. I demonstrated with absolute scientific certainty that if those trees were removed, the resulting soil erosion would inevitably cause the manicured backyards of the crest to slide violently into the lake. I handed the bound report to the city inspector. He took one look at the erosion data, realized the liability the city would face, and immediately closed the case. I had defeated their bureaucratic assault with cold, hard facts. But in doing so, I had humiliated a board of very wealthy, very powerful people. And humiliated people do not just walk away. The harassment quickly turned deeply personal and intensely psychological. Since they couldn't use the city to strip away my privacy, they decided to make my sanctuary completely unlivable. It started with the lights. One evening, as I was sitting on my back porch listening to the crickets, the hillside above me suddenly erupted in blinding, artificial daylight. 3 of the estates directly behind my property had installed massive, commercial-grade stadium floodlights on their extended back decks. They were angled downward, specifically targeting my house. The light was so intensely bright it pierced through the thick leaves, casting long, eerie shadows across my lawn and flooding my bedroom with a harsh, clinical glare. It was a siege. They left the lights on all night, every night. They wanted to deprive me of sleep. They wanted to make my home feel like the yard of a maximum security prison. When I tried to retreat to my backyard during the day, the noise pollution began. They coordinated a schedule of aggressive landscaping. Leaf blowers, power washers, and heavy masonry saws would mysteriously start roaring the second I stepped out my back door. The stress became a physical weight pressing down on my chest. I couldn't focus on my work. The peaceful evenings playing badminton or reading by the water were entirely gone, replaced by the constant, suffocating feeling of being watched and targeted. My safe haven had been transformed into a psychological war zone. I was exhausted, anxious, and running on fumes. But I refused to break. I bought blackout curtains, wore noise-canceling headphones, and stood my ground. So, the HOA decided it was time to cross the physical boundary. The first real violation was subtle but terrifying. I was walking the perimeter of my property early one Saturday morning, inspecting the underbrush near the base of the ridge. That's when I saw it. Tied tightly around the trunks of 4 of my oldest, tallest oak trees were strips of bright, neon orange surveyor's tape. My blood ran cold. Someone had been on my land. Someone had physically crossed the boundary line in the middle of the night, navigated the steep drop-off, and marked my trees. They weren't just complaining about the view anymore. They were mapping out a demolition. The feeling of violation was absolute. My property was no longer safe. I immediately drove to the hardware store, maxed out my credit card on high-definition, motion-activated trail cameras, and spent the entire weekend hiding them deep in the brush, angling them up toward the ridge. I became a prisoner in my own home, constantly checking the live feeds on my phone, waiting for the intruders to return. 2 days later, the cameras caught them. In the dead of night, the infrared lenses captured the crisp, glowing silhouettes of 3 men. They were dressed in dark clothing, slipping down the rocky incline holding laser measuring tools and clipboards. They were calculating the exact drop angles and fall trajectories for the trees. The HOA board wasn't just planning to cut my canopy. They were planning a covert, highly orchestrated destruction of my property. I took the footage directly to the local police, demanding they file criminal trespassing charges. But the officers just sighed. Without clear facial identification in the dark footage, and facing a wall of wealthy residents who would easily afford expensive defense attorneys, the police claimed their hands were tied. They called it a civil matter. They told me to hire a lawyer. The HOA knew the police wouldn't touch them. They knew they operated in a gray area where wealth provided a shield against consequences. They were untouchable. With the law turning a blind eye, the board launched what they believed would be their final, fatal strike. A massive parcel arrived at my door via certified courier. It was a terrifyingly thick legal binder from one of the most ruthless, expensive real estate litigation firms in the state. The HOA was officially suing me. The lawsuit was a masterpiece of legal fiction. They claimed that an obscure, century-old ancient view easement existed on the land, arguing that my trees were a malicious nuisance erected specifically to harm their property values. The document demanded the immediate removal of the tree line and sought hundreds of thousands of dollars in damages. It was a tactic designed to bankrupt me before I ever saw the inside of a courtroom. They knew I couldn't afford to fight a protracted legal battle against a community treasury overflowing with millions of dollars. For a week, I lived in a state of sheer, unadulterated panic. I stopped eating. I barely slept. I spent every waking hour poring over property law, searching for a single lifeline in a sea of intimidating legal jargon. I finally found a brilliant, scrappy local attorney who saw right through the HOA's bluff. He quickly filed a motion to dismiss, proving the ancient easement was a complete fabrication. The judge threw the HOA's lawsuit out of court. It was a massive, euphoric victory. I had beaten their legal team. I had protected my land. For the first time in months, the stadium lights on the hill turned off. The noise stopped. The ridge was completely silent. I thought I had won. I thought the silence was the sound of their surrender. But the silence was just a smokescreen. The exhaustion of the past 6 months finally caught up to me. Believing the war was over, I decided to take a much-needed weekend trip to the mountains, just 2 days away to clear my head, breathe some fresh air, and forget about property lines and lawsuits. I locked up the house, turned on the security system, and drove away feeling lighter than I had in a year. It was a Saturday morning, and I was sitting in a quiet diner miles away from the lake, finally feeling at peace. Then, my phone vibrated against the table. It was a motion alert from one of the hidden trail cameras. I swiped open the notification, expecting to see a deer or a raccoon wandering through the brush. Instead, the live feed showed a terrifying scene. Two massive, unmarked commercial bucket trucks were parked at the very edge of the ridge in the crest. Thick, heavy-duty climbing ropes were already dropping down into my property. Several men wearing hard hats and climbing gear were actively rappelling down the cliff face, landing squarely on my dirt. My heart stopped. I frantically tapped the screen, trying to switch to a different camera angle to see what they were doing. Suddenly, the screen glitched. The feed froze, pixelated, and then went completely black. Connection lost. They had found the cameras. They were blinding my security system. Panic seized my chest so violently I couldn't breathe. I threw cash on the diner table, sprinted to my car, and drove back toward the lake with terrifying speed. Every red light felt like an eternity. Every slow-moving truck was an agonizing obstacle. My mind raced with horrifying possibilities. They had waited for me to leave. They had monitored my movements, knowing exactly when my sanctuary would be defenseless. I turned onto my dirt access road, my tires throwing up a massive cloud of dust. But long before I could even see my house, the dread became absolute. It wasn't a visual cue that confirmed my worst nightmare. It was a sound, echoing off the water, ripping through the peaceful morning air, was the violent, deafening, synchronized roar of heavy-duty, commercial chainsaws. The truck slammed into park. I didn't even shut off the engine. I stumbled out of the cab, my boots hitting the dirt, but the ground didn't feel like my property anymore. Felt like a graveyard. The smell of raw sap, sawdust, and exhaust hung in the air so thick I could taste it. Where a majestic, impenetrable wall of century-old oaks had stood for generations, there was nothing but a chaotic massacre of splintered wood and jagged, weeping stumps. The massive trunks, thicker than a car, had been ruthlessly quartered and dragged aside. The lush, green canopy that had shielded my sanctuary from the world was completely gone. In its place was a gaping, violently torn hole in the landscape. And through that hole I could see exactly what they had done it for. For the first time since I bought the property, I had a completely unobstructed view of the massive glass windows and sprawling decks of the crest directly above me, and they had a perfectly clear, panoramic view of the lake, right over the shattered remains of my forest. Standing at the edge of his expansive, cantilevered balcony, looking down at the destruction with a steaming mug of coffee in his hand, was the president of the HOA. He didn't hide. He didn't look away. He simply stood there, absorbing the morning sun, a sickening, triumphant smirk plastered across his face. He actually raised his coffee mug slightly in my direction, a silent, mocking toast to his own untouchable arrogance. My vision tunneled. A rage so visceral and white-hot erupted in my chest that my hands shook uncontrollably. I dialed 911, screaming into the phone about a violent trespass and destruction of property. But by the time the county sheriff's cruisers came sliding down the gravel road, the chainsaws were already silent. The unmarked bucket trucks were packed up, and the contractors were leaning against their bumpers, looking entirely unbothered. The interaction with the police was an agonizing, humiliating lesson in how the wealthy manipulate the law. I watched from my driveway as the lead officer spoke with the tree removal foreman. The foreman simply produced a forged, conveniently misprinted work order and claimed a GPS error. He played the part of the apologetic, confused contractor perfectly. They claimed they thought they were on the HOA's side of the property line clearing brush. The HOA president, of course, had completely vanished back inside his fortress, leaving the contractors to take the heat. The sheriff walked over to me, his expression full of weary pity, and delivered the crushing blow. Because the contractors were claiming a simple mapping mistake, and because there was no hard, immediate proof that the HOA board had explicitly ordered the destruction of trees on my specific parcel, no one was leaving in handcuffs. It wasn't a felony. It was a civil dispute regarding property boundaries and accidental damages. The most the police could do was issue a minor citation for trespassing. The contractors would be fined a few $100s, a drop in the bucket that the HOA treasury would quietly reimburse, and I was left to sue for the monetary value of the timber. They knew exactly what they were doing. They had calculated the cost of the legal loophole. To them, paying a contractor to take the fall and tossing me a few $1,000s in a civil settlement for accidental wood removal was just the cheap price of buying their multimillion-dollar Lakeview. They thought they had outsmarted me. They thought my devastation was the end of the war. That night was the darkest of my life. With the trees gone, my property was entirely exposed. The moment the sun dipped below the horizon, the HOA activated their stadium floodlights. The blinding, clinical glare hit my house like a physical blow, illuminating every room, stripping away the last remaining ounce of my privacy. I sat on the floor of my living room, surrounded by the stark, artificial daylight, staring at the shadows of the stumps on my lawn. The helplessness was suffocating. They had destroyed my sanctuary, and the law had held the door open for them. But as I sat there, staring at the raw, exposed cliff face where my trees used to anchor the soil, the paralyzing grief slowly hardened into something else. The cold, analytical part of my brain, the geographic data specialist who had already mapped every inch of this terrain, began to churn. I remembered the fire marshal. I remembered the meticulous, bound report I had submitted to the county months ago to defeat the HOA's fake safety complaints. I had legally established, with signed county stamps and geotechnical data, that the root systems of those specific oak trees were the only structural elements preventing the steep, rocky ridge of the crest from collapsing onto my property. By illegally cutting down those trees, the HOA hadn't just stolen my privacy. They had officially, legally destabilized a major geological drop-off. A slow, dangerous smile crept across my face. I didn't want their money. I didn't want a civil settlement for the price of firewood. I wanted to make them suffer in a way that money could never fix. They wanted a view of the lake so badly that they were willing to destroy my life for it. I decided I was going to give them a view they would never, ever forget. The next morning, I didn't call a lawyer. I didn't file a civil suit. I called the County Department of Environmental Protection and Emergency Zoning. I submitted a massive, urgent filing, attaching the police report of the tree removal alongside my previous geotechnical erosion study. I formally declared that the unauthorized clear-cutting had triggered an immediate, catastrophic landslide risk to my residential dwelling. Under county emergency statutes, I wasn't just requesting permission to build a retaining structure. I was legally demanding the right to construct a commercial-grade, extreme-height debris shield directly on the property line to protect my home from the impending collapse of their hillside. The county engineers, terrified of municipal liability for a potential landslide, fast-tracked the emergency permit in record time. They granted me a total variance. No height restrictions. No aesthetic guidelines. No HOA approval required. I had a blank check to build whatever I deemed necessary to stop the falling rock. I immediately liquidated a portion of my retirement savings and made a series of frantic calls to a commercial logistics and salvage yard 2 towns over. I didn't hire landscapers to plant tiny, pathetic saplings that would take 50 years to grow. I hired heavy machinery. 3 days later, the quiet lakeside morning was shattered once again, but this time, it wasn't the sound of chainsaws. It was the earth-shaking, guttural roar of a convoy of heavy-duty flatbed semi-trucks and a towering commercial construction crane rolling down my dirt road. The residents of the crest, who had been enjoying their stolen, panoramic lake views all week, stepped out onto their glass balconies, pointing and staring in absolute confusion. The HOA president marched out to the edge of the ridge, his phone already to his ear, his face twisted in a mixture of rage and panic as he watched the massive crane extend its hydraulic legs onto my lawn. They watched in horrified silence as the flatbeds began to unload my new debris shields. They weren't elegant stone walls. They weren't tasteful wooden fences. They were decommissioned, 40-foot-long corrugated steel shipping containers. I had specifically requested the ugliest, most heavily rusted, industrial battered containers the salvage yard had in stock. They were dented, covered in peeling industrial paint, and streaked with decades of maritime grime. The crane operator didn't hesitate. He hoisted the first massive steel box into the air, swung it over the property line, and slammed it down directly on the boundary, right at the base of the ridge. The impact shook the hillside. Then came the second container, then the third. But I wasn't stopping at a single layer. Guided by my emergency variants for extreme vertical debris mitigation, the crane began to stack them. 2 high, 3 high. For high, we were building an impenetrable 50-foot-tall solid steel fortress wall. We welded the massive corrugated boxes together, creating an iron curtain that stretched the entire length of the property line, completely swallowing the jagged stumps of my murdered oaks. As the final container was lowered into place, the sun was perfectly positioned to cast a massive, cooling shadow over my entire yard. The blinding stadium lights of the HOA were entirely blocked. My privacy had been instantly, brutally restored. But the real masterpiece was the view from the other side. I walked to the edge of the towering steel monolith and looked up at the ridge. The $1 million panoramic lake view that the HOA had committed a crime to steal was completely, permanently gone. Every single multi-million-dollar estate featuring floor-to-ceiling glass, windows and sprawling entertainment decks now looked directly into a 50-foot-high wall of dented, rusted, decaying industrial steel. The HOA president stood on his balcony, his jaw slack, his face completely drained of color as the rusted metal eclipsed his entire horizon. He had tried to bury me. He had tried to erase my sanctuary. But as the crane blew its air horn in a deafening salute to a finished job, he realized the terrifying truth. He hadn't just lost the war. He had funded his own permanent prison. The silence that fell over the lake that afternoon was different from the peace I had known before. It wasn't the soft, natural quiet of wind rustling through ancient oak leaves. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of absolute, catastrophic defeat. As the massive commercial crane folded its hydraulic legs and the convoy of flatbed trucks rumbled back up my dirt road, the sheer permanence of what I had just built settled over the landscape. A 50-foot-tall, impenetrable wall of heavily rusted, dented, industrial shipping containers now ran the entire length of my property line. It was a monument to malicious compliance, a brutal, ironclad consequence erected directly in the face of unbound entitlement. For the first few hours, the residents of the Crest simply stood on their sprawling glass balconies, paralyzed by the sheer aesthetic horror of their new reality. They had paid premiums, millions of dollars, for panoramic, unobstructed views of the shimmering water. They had schemed, harassed, and eventually broken the law to eliminate my trees to perfect that view. Now, their floor-to-ceiling windows looked out at peeling maritime paint, massive dented steel ridges, and faded industrial serial numbers. The sun, which used to reflect beautifully off the lake into their living rooms, now baked the rusted metal, radiating a dull, oppressive heat back up the hillside. The panic began by nightfall. The HOA, assuming they could simply use their wealth and political connections to bully the city into removing my wall, activated their expensive lawyers. But they quickly discovered the beautiful, agonizing trap they had walked themselves into. When the sun went down, a few of the more arrogant residents attempted to retaliate by turning on their commercial stadium floodlights, the same lights they had used to psychologically torture me for months. But physics is a stubborn thing. The massive, corrugated steel containers didn't let the light pass through. Instead, the raw metal acted as a massive, diffused mirror. The blinding glare bounced directly off the rusted wall and shot right back up the ridge, flooding their own glass-fronted houses with a harsh, inescapable, blinding light. Within 20 minutes, every single stadium light on the hill was permanently switched off. The darkness was absolute. My sanctuary was finally mine again. But the true devastation for the crest arrived on Monday morning, when the HOA president and his high-priced legal team stormed into the county zoning office, demanding the immediate demolition of my illegal junk structure. They were met with cold, bureaucratic apathy. The county engineer pulled up the file and calmly laid out the paperwork. He showed them the emergency geotechnical variance I had filed. He showed them the data proving the hillside was unstable. And then he produced the police report, the very same police report the HOA contractors had used to escape felony charges by claiming the tree clearing was a simple, accidental mistake. The engineer explained the reality of their situation with devastating clarity. Because the HOA's contractors had accidentally destroyed the critical root systems holding the terraced ridge together, the county officially designated the hillside as an active landslide hazard. My 50-foot steel wall was no longer just a privacy fence. It was legally classified as a mandatory, emergency structural retaining shield. The county didn't just refuse to order the demolition of my containers. They informed the HOA lawyers that removing the steel wall would be a criminal violation of county safety codes. The containers were there to stay, permanently, to protect my residential dwelling from the geological disaster the HOA themselves had caused. Furthermore, the county hit the Homeowners Association with a massive six-figure fine for unauthorized topographical destabilization. They had tried to use a legal loophole to steal my trees, and that exact same loophole had just cemented a permanent, rusted steel fortress directly in their line of sight. The collapse of the crest was spectacular, fast, and entirely self-inflicted. The neighborhood, once a united front of wealthy elites targeting a lone homeowner, turned into a vicious, cannibalistic war zone. The realization that their multimillion-dollar lake views were permanently replaced by an industrial salvage yard sent property values into an immediate, unprecedented freefall. Real estate agents wept. Homes that were listed for $3 million couldn't get a single viewing. Prospective buyers would drive through the pristine, manicured gates, walk into the luxurious living rooms, look out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the towering wall of maritime rust, and walk right back out. The premium lakefront neighborhood had become the laughingstock of the local real estate market. Faced with plummeting net worths and the county's six-figure destabilization fine, the residents turned their fury onto the HOA board. The very people who had silently supported the harassment and the illegal logging now claimed they were victims of a rogue leadership. A massive class action lawsuit was filed internally, with dozens of homeowners suing the HOA president and the board of directors for gross fiduciary negligence and the destruction of their property values. The community treasury, once a war chest used to bully outsiders, was rapidly drained by internal legal defense fees. To keep the association afloat, the board was forced to levy catastrophic special assessment fees on every single resident. Families were paying tens of thousands of dollars out of pocket simply to fund the legal battles tearing their own neighborhood apart. The HOA president, the man who had stood on his balcony with a coffee mug, smirking at the destruction of my century-old oaks, experienced a downfall so complete it was almost cinematic. Stripped of his presidency in a unanimous, vitriolic vote of no confidence, he became a pariah in the community he had helped build. His neighbors wouldn't look at him. His tires were mysteriously slashed in his own driveway. The social isolation became unbearable. Desperate to escape the nightmare he had engineered, he listed his sprawling estate for sale. It sat on the market for 14 agonizing months. The house that sat directly center stage to the highest, most battered section of my steel wall was completely unmarketable. Eventually, facing mounting legal bills and sheer psychological exhaustion, he was forced to sell the property to a corporate flipper for a staggering 60% loss. Watching the moving trucks haul away his luxury furniture, passing under the shadow of the rusted shipping containers he had forced me to build, was a moment of profound, quiet vindication. He had lost his wealth, his status, and his home. Down at the bottom of the hill, behind my ironclad boundary, life began to heal. The loss of my ancient oaks still carried a heavy ache. You cannot replace a century of nature with a check or a clever engineering trick. But the raw, exposed wound of my property eventually gave way to a new kind of beauty. I didn't leave the inside of the containers looking like an industrial wasteland. That was the punishment reserved strictly for the people on the hill. On my side of the wall, the side facing my modest cedar ranch house, I brought in soil and began to plant. I installed creeping fig, fast-growing ivy, and thick, cascading vines at the base of the corrugated steel. Within a year, the harsh metal on my side was completely swallowed by a vibrant, living wall of green. I welded a beautiful, elevated wooden deck to the lower tiers of the containers, turning the massive structure into a multi-level garden. I hung string lights that cast a warm, inviting glow in the evenings. Protected by 50 feet of solid steel, the noise of the world above completely vanished. I couldn't hear their cars. I couldn't hear their landscaping equipment. I couldn't see their judgmental stares. My lakeside ranch was a sanctuary once again. It was different than the one I had originally purchased, but in many ways it was profoundly better. It was a fortress of my own making, tested by the absolute worst of human entitlement and solidified by my refusal to be broken. When I sit on my back porch now, listening to the water lap against the shore and watching the fireflies dance against my towering, ivy-covered wall, I think about the sheer hubris of the people who used to look down on me. They believed that the rules didn't apply to them. They believed that wealth granted them ownership of everything their eyes could see, regardless of where the lines were drawn on a map. They mistook my desire for peace as a sign of weakness. They learned the hard way that when you force a quiet man into a corner, and when you tear down the natural boundaries that separate your world from his, you don't conquer him. You just force him to build a wall you can never, ever tear down. How much is an unobstructed view really worth? Because for the residents of the crest, stealing mine cost them absolutely everything, and giving them exactly what they deserved was the greatest view I could have ever asked for.